Thanks everyone for coming to this talk. I, for one, am really looking forward to hear Blaine talk on how you should build an indie game. After 25 years in tech, anything I can do to get away from writing SQL statements or VLOOKUPs is well appreciated. I can only assume everybody else has the same idea, Blaine, so please welcome Blaine to the stage.
Hello. Okay, so this is my talk on why and how you should build an indie game. So when I started making this, it started turning into a whole lot more how than why. So quick rundown of why: because it's fun, because it's hard, and because if you're here, you're probably curious about it. And generally, I think you should always follow the thread of curiosity. So to go straight into it, who am I? So my name's Blaine McKeever. I probably started building games as a hobbyist in around 2016. It's actually what inspired me to go get a software engineering degree in the first place. So I actually did that. I went and got a software engineering degree. I graduated in 2022 from Queen's. And then after that, I went to work in the industry for the past 2 years, an indie studio up the road, Rocket Flare. We specialized in survival city builders and simulation games. So what are we actually going to cover here? So I'm going to talk about the process, the different steps of the game development lifecycle, and what we actually need to do in each. I'll clearly define the goal and what specifically we're aiming to build. We'll talk about the tools for the job. There's a lot of software out there for building video games. I'll give recommendations based on the experience I've had. We'll talk about building the product itself, shipping the game, finishing the project, and getting out in front of players. So I'm going to quickly run through the game development lifecycle. So we first start with setting a solid plan. You'll then need to go into pre-production, where you'll define the tools that you'll actually need. You go into production, building the game. We'll touch a wee touch on playtesting, getting player feedback, and then we'll go into the pre-launch and what needs to be considered before the big step of launching the game. As we go through this process, I'm actually going to relate back to a little prototype that I've been building out this year, Lander. So Lander is a side project that is currently in prototype. I will release it, but it's a bit off public release yet. It's a small in scope, 2D precision platformer with a focus on a high skill ceiling. The reason I've chosen Lander is that it was built using a process very, very closely to this one. It is kind of the culmination of all the lessons that I've learned so far in game development. So we start with the first stage of the process, planning. So first, we're going to define the goal. Before anything, you must budget. You only have finite resources, time and money, in this case, time. I would say, if you're doing this part-time on the side, set yourself aside a solid month. It's enough time to make something decent, but not so long that momentum and motivation start to dissipate. So what are we actually going to build in the month? I'm assuming that you here have never built a game before. And at the start of a project, it's very important that you take stock on your ability. If you've completed the process several times, you can build something more ambitious within the same time frame. As it was our first project, however, I advise that you be realistic, think small, think very small, think sort of old school arcade games, the likes of Pong, Breakout, Asteroids. Do not set out to build your dream video game. It is not feasible. It will simply take an eternity. So the reason we allocate resource first is because we must finish the process. It is so important to get the process down because, in my opinion, you can't build a good video game without a good refined process. Also, often with game development, the greatest reward actually comes at the end. So in indie game development, there's no analogy of hats. To be honest, it's kind of drawn out at this point, but it works. At times, you will wear different hats. You will wear the programmer's black baseball cap. You will wear the artist's pastel-colored beret. You will wear the beatmaker's mid-beanie. But ultimately, you are the producer. The producer's hat cannot be taken off, ever. It is the producer's job to get the process finished, and we must finish that process. So for this project, you're probably going solo, but I would advise that you try and onboard others. They can wear the other hats when you're not. So you'll be swapping these 3 hats frequently, and when you feel a drop in motivation in one discipline, it means that the others can pick up where you've left off. When We all also know what it's like to be stuck on a problem for 4 hours and then solve it in the first 20 minutes the next day. Okay, so when you're planning, you need to set out your scope. So what actually is scope? Scope is everything that makes up the game itself. It can be described in terms of the features, the mechanics, and the assets. It is hard limited by the budget. A feature is a system or a tool of development. A level editor is a feature. A save system is a feature. A mechanic is a rule about how the game system itself works. The A button accelerates the lander, making it thrust forward. That is a mechanic. If the lander's velocity is greater than 200 when a collision occurs, it explodes. It is a rule about the game. That is a mechanic. Assets are the files that make up the game. A script file is an asset. An audio file is an asset. An image file is an asset. Make your game scope as small as feasibly possible. Lander's mechanics initially were single button and D-pad movement on traversal from point A to B, restart. For its features, it had a main menu, it had a load system, or a level load system, sorry, and audio playback system. For assets, it was literally just a visual representation of the lander and point A and point B. So when chatting about scope, I want to talk about a commonly used phrase in game development, scope creep. So scope creep is when a project continues to add mechanics, features, and assets that take it beyond the maximum threshold of the budget itself. It's so easy to fall into the lure of scope creep, and we're setting out the small scope possible to avoid overscoping. You do not have a good estimation of how long it takes to produce a game of this scope yet. So we know what we want our scope to be, the smallest thing possible. The difference in scope between a 3D project and a 2D project is incredibly easy to underestimate. By going 3D, everything contained within the scope, every asset, every mechanic, and every feature becomes exponentially more difficult to implement. And it is for that reason that I strongly advise, for your first project, stick with 2D. It's also worth noting here that a 3D game doesn't necessarily mean a better game than 2D. What a 3D game can often do is give it a lot more appeal. Its ability to attract eyeballs. Looking at a game and playing a game are two very, very different things. Also, 2D games can actually be built as an inexpensive proof of concept before you go into making a 3D one. If you make a game in 2D this time round and you're like, oh, this design's solid, then next time make it in 3D. So I would also say you should imitate and deconstruct. Game design is very, very tough. You will already have 4 jobs on this project, and so I would advise that you seek a proven design. To do this, think of games in the same genre that you have enjoyed and that are very, very small. 2 games that grabbed me were a Flash game from 2005 called N, and an old arcade game from 1979, Lunar Lander. In the end, what I wanted to do was take the confined levels, momentum, and speed of N and apply that to the cumbersome, slow, and fragile Lunar Lander. It is much more realistic for your first game to make an iterative step than a revolutionary leap when it comes to game design. Many of you will have played lots of little games. Think Wordle, the Chrome Dinosaur Drunk game, Minesweeper, Space Cadet Pinball. Choose one that you already like and make it into the currently defined scope, the smallest thing possible. So to do this, you need to define your chosen game's core loop. In games, the MVP is the core loop. The core loop is the smallest unit of a game you can have. You know it's the core loop if you can no longer take any features, mechanics, or assets out of the game and still have a game. The core loop of Lander initially was to get from point A to B using the D-pad and a single button. If you removed any of those steps, it would no longer be a game. Take the game that you've chosen for inspiration and distill it into its core loop. So take Wordle, for example. The core loop of Wordle would be to be presented with an empty box and 2 filled boxes below it, one red, one blue. You would then click either the red or the blue box, and then the empty box would change to red or blue, showing if you got it right or wrong. Then repeat that process. You can take away the words, the letters, the keyboard, and even the repeated guesses. However, you couldn't take away any more of this, or it wouldn't be a game at all. That is Wordle's core loop. It's probably worth saying as well, the genre a game fits into is often the core loop itself. Your scope, the smallest scope possible, is the core loop and the features to facilitate it. So, all right, we have a rock solid plan. We have the budget, we have the goal, we have the scope, and we have the hats. Now we need to decide on what we're actually going to use to build it. So, the tools you need, first things first, asset creation. You're going to need a code editor to write your scripts. You're going to need a graphics editor to draw your sprites and UI, and you're going to need an audio editor for your sound effects. So these are the tools of asset creation, but there's still one essential tool missing. We need something, some kind of system or framework, to bring these assets together and then present them as a game. And this leads to probably the biggest question every new game developer will come to: should I use an engine? So before I answer that, I actually want to say what an engine is. So in the loosest possible terms, a game engine is the system that brings all of the assets together and turns them into the game. When people say build your own engine, they mean to use a framework or a library such as SDL2, Raylib, Pygame, Monogame, SML2, OpenGL, the list goes on and on. They are frameworks, they are absolutely amazing, and many of you are probably developers. If you start reading into them, you will probably want to use them, but for your first game, don't. You should use an engine. And the main reason you should use an engine is because of our budget. We do not have the time or the resources to get this finished without one on our first go. So we know the kinds of tools we are going to need. Now we must pick the right tools for the job. And tools are exactly that. Tools are a means to make your life easier. Do not take a sledgehammer to a nail. It might be fun, but it is very messy. For this project, we have an incredibly narrow scope. Our game is going to be simple as far as games go. And the best tools for making simple games are simple themselves. They're lightweight, they're fast, and they're frictionless. You can churn out assets, features, and mechanics really quickly, and then get iterating on them. So when it comes to picking your tools, pick the engine first. The engine is the core of everything. It is more important that the other tools play well with the engine than the engine playing well with them. That is because it is easier to swap out the other tools than it is to swap out your entire engine. And based on the requirements of our tools and the scope of this project, I would actually strongly recommend you use Godot. I have used other engines. I used Unity daily for the past 2 years. Godot is the champion of rapid game development for games of this scope. And actually, a lot of people are catching on too. So these pie charts are the submissions to the Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam over the years. And a big reason for Godot's popularity would be when it comes to selecting your code editor, Godot is not only your engine, but it is also your code editor. So Godot uses its own scripting language, GDScript. GDScript has a Python-like syntax. It has very little syntactic sugar. It is very easy to both read and write. It is also very well documented, and it is documented specifically for games. What I would say, though, is the code editor in Godot itself is serviceable. It absolutely has its problems, and features you like in code editors that you use probably won't be in it. But it has everything we need, and having the code editor baked into the engine speeds up the iteration times dramatically. The type of game we're building here and the way we're building it means that the productivity gains from using GDScript far outweigh the cons. So we have our engine or code editor. We now need to select our graphics editor. So I am no trained artist, and you do not have to be either. You only need to make simple, unique abstractions for the objects in your game. For Lander, the Lander is literally a triangle. Your character could be a box. Just make something plain and simple and get it in. You can iterate on it later. The best tool I've found for this level of detail is a pixel art editor called Asprit, and it would get my recommendation. If you can use other graphics editing programs, such as Photoshop, Procreate, etc., absolutely, you can go ahead and use those. So we have our engine, code editor, graphics editor. So select your audio editor. Also, I am no musician, and again, you do not have to be either. Sound effects are enough for now. You can definitely make a decent sound effect. Also, making sound effects is a lot of fun. You can get away without music for now, but I wouldn't leave out audio entirely, because even sound effects can actually be really good for setting the tone of a game. My recommendation is 8 or 16-bit audio generator or sound effect generator. This is BFXer. Like art, actually, though, if you know how to work a good instrument or DAW, such as Ableton, Reaper, Logic, Pro Tools, any of those, absolutely have at it. So the final tool is everybody's favorite, version control. I strongly recommend you use version control, whether you're collaborating or not. When you're building your game, you will wander off into the woods, and you absolutely will get lost. Version control is the map and compass to get back to camp. Follow the common practices of version control. Commit and push your work often is a great skill to build. Write informative and concise commit messages. Conventional commits is a good template for that. Also, the other thing I would say about version control is that the history in the repo itself is a good way to track your progress. If you look back on the history, you'll be able to see the sort of cadence you're getting when you're implementing your features, assets, et cetera, et cetera. Overall, my recommendation goes to Git. Git is fairly ubiquitous in development at this point, and you can never know it well enough. Git also actually plays very well with Godot. Godot was built from the ground up with Git in mind as the version control software of choice for its users. As for other assets, Git will play nicely with them too. So it is generally bad practice to put large binary files into Git. People do it anyway, though. I do it anyway, though. But the binary file sizes that are going to be coming out of the asset creation programs I just recommended there are so small that that actually isn't even a concern. Okay, so we're going to go into production. We have a clear plan. We've defined the goals and the scope. We've selected the tools to build it. Now we need to build the thing. So the core loop, start building towards the MVP, the core loop. For Lander, this was building out the character controller to get the player moving. It was creating the sprite to give the player the visual representation of the character, and it was setting up the collision detection for when the lander actually reached point B. Do not get too hung up on writing perfect code. This is a first implementation of the core loop. Just focus on getting it made and getting it working. Also, I would say at this point, this is very difficult, and do not be too hard on yourself. You will be encountering lots of problems and solving lots of problems. Once you have implemented the core loop, you will have implemented all of the mechanics that were defined in the scope. Okay, so with the core loop implement the rest of the scope. Build out the other necessary features. Be sure to include even first implementations of audio and art assets. It forces you to implement the features that you need to get all the assets in and working. It will also give you a good handle on the asset creation tools themselves. You're going to need to build a title screen and a menu. Implementing these now is great because it gives you a good grasp on the UI implementation pipeline. And as you're doing this, I would strongly advise you write developer feedback on features, assets, and mechanics as you build them. If you have a function doing far too many things, but it does work, take a note of it for now, that it needs a refactor. Doing this now will be very, very helpful later. So once you've actually implemented the core loop and the features to facilitate it, congratulations, because you have actually technically built a video game. And at this point, you should have features implemented with very questionable code, garish sprites, harsh sounds, terrible UI, and a really ugly start screen. This is what is known as a prototype, a cobbled together end-to-end system that works literally just about. This is a proof of concept. Developing this rapidly allows us to get to the next stage of the process as quickly as possible. That stage being playtesting. So if you've made it this far, you're doing absolutely brilliantly. Honestly, it takes a lot to get to this point, so congratulate yourself if you make it this far. But you need to play the game. So playtesting is probably the most important part of the entire process. Playtesting is going to give you a really good sense of if the game is actually good or not, what is currently working, what needs iteration, or what simply is not there, it's missing entirely. Take note of your thoughts, emotions, and critiques as you play the game. So thoughts like, this is way too easy. Emotions such as like the frustration when you're trying to click a button and it just will not click. Or critiques like, you like the sound of that, but it's really, really flat. So after a few rounds of playtesting, you're actually going to become a terrible playtester. And that is why you need to get the game in front of other people. You will have your established patterns of play. The mind is very, very lazy. It wants to make things as automatic as possible. Your morning routine will be so ingrained that you literally don't think about it. You just absent-mindedly do it. This is known as chunking. You chunk the behavior pattern in the brain, so you don't need to use as much energy to do it again. But this is a problem when you're playtesting, because you need different patterns of play, so you need different brains. When someone else is playtesting your game, tell them that you aren't going to give them much direction, and then don't. You want them to voice and show their authentic experience. Saying anything will be of detriment to the playtest itself. What they say is important, but is often less important than their behavior. They will say what they think you want to hear, especially if it is a friend or family. Body language and in-game behavior are way more important than words. They may say this is too difficult, they're frustrated, but they'll lean forward and they'll try it again. The game wasn't too hard, it was just hard enough to get them invested. They believe that they can overcome the challenge. The difficulty was actually absolutely spot on. It would have been too difficult if they just stopped playing the game entirely. So during playtesting, take plenty of notes, but do not be tempted to implement your feedback just yet, because it's still currently outside of scope. We are not going to play the game of scope creep, because you cannot win the game of scope creep. So prioritize your feedback. You will have lots of feedback. During production, I mentioned about writing feedback on the implementation of your features, mechanics, and assets as you go, as you make them. Take this feedback, add it to the playtest feedback, go through all of it and prioritize it. Prioritizing feedback is a skill in itself. You'll be trying to prioritize based on opinions from you as the developer, you as the player, and the other as the player. It is very, very difficult to do. Try to strike a balance between all three of them. The more rounds of playtesting, prioritizing feedback, and implementing it you do, the better sense you will then start to get of what is most important to your game. So, pre-launch, we have built a thing. Nice one. We've playtested it rigorously by ourselves and others. We've collated it and prioritized the feedback. So, package it, give it a version, semantic versioning, 0.0.1 prototype or whatever. Get it out of the editor and make a playable build, because it will never build first time. It just never happens. It just doesn't. Create a named release. Creating a named release actually feels really lovely. It's like reaching a proper milestone. And also from a practicality standpoint, it's a really good point to refer back to. Make some promotional images, material. So grab some screenshots, build up the game, make a wee gameplay video, maybe a cool GIF. Include them in the package. And then take the package that you have made and host it. So set up store platform pages where the game is going to live. Get it onto those platforms, even if on a private listing. itch.io is a brilliant platform for this, and I would absolutely recommend you put your stuff there. Include the promotional material that we made for the package. Platforms will actually often ask for your images, GIFs, videos, all that sort of stuff. Do fill those fields out whenever you're making the submission. Get it to the point that you're literally ready to press the launch button and then don't launch it. Why would you not launch it? So we've been following this process as if it's a waterfall methodology. But as in any respectable video game, the waterfall has a secret behind it. This waterfall secret is that it is not a waterfall at all. It is a cycle. So check your remaining time budget. You now have implemented with everything within scope. You've done everything and you have a video game. Check your time budget. If you have time, go through the process again with a slightly expanded scope. So how to know what fits in the new scope? Using the get history and based on your newfound judgment, you'll be able to estimate more accurately how long it takes you to actually build out parts of your game. Take half the time remaining. This is the new time budget for this time around the loop. Fill this time budget with as many high priority tasks from the feedback as possible. This is the new expanded scope. Okay, so when you go back down into pre-production, are your tools still capable of implementing the feedback? Is common feedback, pixel art isn't working, ASPRIT just is not working, change out the tool. Are the sounds from the sound generator too harsh? Change it out for a DAW and a really good VST. Is Godot incapable of accurately reflecting a particle off a tile with an occlusion layer? Probably. Perhaps you should change the tool. Do you have the time? So, more feature work. Address feature feedback by creating solutions or iterating. Is your development feedback that you've noted it takes far too long to build out levels? Could you make a dev tool? Development tools are very nice features that speed up creation. A level editor is exactly that. So balance the mechanics. The game's too easy. I can just crash my way to the end. Implement a mechanic so that when the lander collides with something, it explodes. Improve the look and the sound. Make things look and sound better. It was hard to distinguish what way the lander was initially pointing, so implement a solution. Bombs are difficult to see. Make it more vibrant. So I hope that now you can see the value of playtesting feedback and prioritization. But the hard truth of the matter is that your video game will never actually be finished. Your time will run out and production must stop. The point of the process is to squeeze out every ounce of value we have from the time we have. The process informs you of the time it takes to do things so that your decisions based on implementation are informed and realistic. It is a system structured so that as soon as the time budget is expended, you're instantly ready to launch the game. Congratulations, you have reached the end of the cycle many times and you now have no time remaining. You have just built and released your first video game. So, yeah, thanks for listening. If you would like to follow my game dev shenanigans, I'm going to be doing that at that QR code. I'd like to give a shout out to the NI Game Dev Network, specifically Caelan. The commitment he has to this community is unreal. Everyone appreciates it, real MVP. I want to give a shout out to NIDC. Thanks for putting together probably the dev event of the year. Absolutely smashed it. Garth Gilmore specifically for inviting me with very short notice. Appreciate that so much. And to all my pals who helped me do this, yous are legends. Thanks.
Do you have any questions for Blaine? Yep.
Blaine, what was your biggest learning from all of this process?
The process of building the game or making the talk?
Whole thing.
The whole thing? If you have the notion to make something, just do it. Like, just absolutely do it and see where it takes you, like, to be honest. Because it will surprise you endlessly. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep, couple.
Do you think that game jams are a good way to sort of get started, or do you think it may be, because I often find with game jams, I often find there's too little time for me to get started from absolute nothing, but what do you think?
Yeah, so to be honest, I actually think you kind of nailed it on the head there. It is very little time, and games are very difficult to make. They're good to kind of get in the way of it, but the other thing is it's kind of like you're purposely burning yourself out. You probably work full time and then you go do a game jam and you are knackered. Whereas if you take longer, you'll have more brain space to actually make something a bit more considered. Do you know what I mean? So yes, they are good for getting your feet wet, but I would say you're better to like set aside 3 to 4 weeks and like give yourself a good pace instead of running yourself into the ground.
Is there one more there?
What's happening?
What's happening?
I wanted to ask, how did you organize the feedback that you were getting for your iterations? Like, did you use any software, or was it literally just a pen and paper? And how were you able to decide what feedback to actually take on and what feedback to kind of ignore?
Yeah, so in terms of how do I organize my feedback, I use Notion and then kind of just use a Kanban within Notion itself. As for choosing what's most important is probably the more you playtest, the more often the problems will come up. So like if you have 6 or 7 people saying it feels a bit floaty, you need to sort it. Or if like, just it tends to be the things that are coming up the most, but also biased slightly towards what you know better as the developer. Yeah.
I think that's everything. Thanks again, Blaine.
Yeah, thanks very much, folks. I really appreciate you coming to this because, yeah, thanks. Cheers.